The series Neon Genesis Evangelion to me was a 10 out of 10. This was a piece of media that sparked curiosity, sparked intrigue, was unnerving, visceral. I'm so blown away by Evangelion and what it represents and how it showcases the different interplays with characters, their relationships, and how these characters sort of respond to each other. The dynamic between the angels and Zayla and the interaction that all of these sort of overarching concepts kind of come into play are astounding. The design of the Evas is mesmerizing, especially the design of 001. The secrets that are uncovered as we progress are just phenomenal. There were several moments that were absolutely peak in every episode, and I binged this thing over the course of like 3 days. I never do that. Musically, I thought it was so incredibly interesting to experience the use of the Beethoven 9 in juxtaposition with what was happening on the screen. It almost felt like that was also the moment of, meeting your maker, meeting Adam, the consciousness of Adam. Having the Ode to Joy play is almost like seeing God itself, which I thought was really interesting. Or like obviously the progenitor of the first sin. Using the Hallelujah from the Handel's Messiah, using that in direct counterpoint to what we typically would expect as a song of celebration, as it like essentially is brain. She even describes it as being, I don't want to say the word just for my own sake for this, but she describes it as essentially being, entered mentally and being, eviscerated mentally. That's a really powerful juxtaposition from what we normally expect when we hear something like the Handel's Messiah. And so that flipping of context is always so interesting because it's not what you think. And that's something that we really benefit from when context is flipped and what we expect becomes the unexpected. I think that's so excellent. I do wish that in the series, the Eva / Angel stuff was expanded on or, showcased in a deeper way, especially episode 19. That I really thought we were going in a totally different direction. Episode 19 was jaw-dropping, and you can watch it on Patreon, but like my mouth was on the floor when I experienced everything that was related to episode 19. That was a specific highlight. Also, the episode where Asuka and Shinji have to work together, and that's another moment of classical music, I think, or I can't remember, but like the synchronization scene was just amazing. Asuka was done dirty in the story. I thought that she definitely got her like victory lap in the end of Evangelion. So the end of Evangelion definitely served Asuka better. I was so excited to watch the end of Evangelion that I like woke up at 5 a.m. to get going with my day so I could watch it. We really don't get these conversations very much. The conversation around id and ego and who am I in this world and what is my purpose? Why am I separate from that person down the street? Why am I different than that person? How am I perceived? Even the scene where Rei sees all the different versions of herself, even though she doesn't know how to process it. When I was watching it, I interpreted that as who's watching the watcher, which is a common idea that we come up with in meditation, where when you're sitting and meditating and breathing, and we even had the sort of like exotic sound there, sort of like Buddhist, sound qualities there a bit. It's like, what happens, who's watching who? And when you're watching yourself breathe and watching your thoughts, as you live, you don't think, you assume your thoughts are you, but what happens when you're actually watching them? And then who's watching that person, that thing watching that? And so that was a concept here that I thought was really exceptional. It deviated from just being like, here's a really cool mech show, to being like, hey, what is your life and how do you choose to live it? Instrumentality was a little bit of a question mark, and Zayla was a bit of a question mark in the series. But overall, I was just so impressed, and honestly, it's like one of the greatest pieces of media I've ever seen in my entire life. Like, I've got the manga on the way that I'm going to read, and I'm looking forward to watching the rebuilds. I've just watched the end of Evangelion, which I have thoughts on. It's just crazy. It's just crazy what kind of a show this is, and how it deviates from what we believe. And I really relate it to Shinji, not so much in the end of Evangelion, but certainly, and 1000%, I related to him in the series because he's very awkward. He's placed in these situations that he doesn't really know how to handle because he's not told to. And the problem is we have all this pressure around everything that happens to him. So he's never able to breathe and really uncover who he is and what his life needs to be, coupled then with the fact that he's around these three, 2 girls and a woman, and that's also very confusing for a young boy. At 14 years old, you're just coming into your own, and you don't even know what the separation of the self even looks like, to be in a situation where you're piloting this mech. Your father doesn't love you and rejects you, and he really treats a classmate with more respect than you, coupled with living with a grown woman who is sexualized by your colleagues and peers, and you try to not see her that way, but you kind of do. And then coupled with then having to live with a girl your age who is really confusing to be with because she's also projecting her own personal journey. Yeah, that's tough. And I really related to a lot of Shinji's struggles, especially with his desire to escape and run away and reject the world around him, and having to show up and really make a decision. It's also really tough. I mean, it's tough to parent yourself. It's tough to parent yourself as an adult, let alone as a 14-year-old. And in the case of Shinji, he has no role models. And unfortunately, he's just lived such a complicated and problematic, life. He hasn't had the luck of the draw. But again, even then, all the different characters have such nuance to them. It's all just so excellent. There's so much at play there. Every character has value and every character has meaning. I don't know that we need all the heady stuff per se, in order to get that. I think it would have been nice to have a real proper sort of arc of this, without all the heady stuff. But I do think that the cerebral, high intellectual subject matter is really interesting to sort of take on. And yeah, and I can't praise Evangelion enough. I'm right obsessed with it, and it's one of the greatest things I've ever seen. Even the ending of End of Evangelion actually bothers me more, just because it's harder to parse versus the sharp ending that we got of the series. The series ending, even though it's jagged and kind of doesn't make sense, I appreciated how it ended. Crazy stuff. This was a ride. Of course, you can watch all of that on Patreon and check it out for yourself. I definitely won't be the same after watching that, but it did also validate a lot of the journey I've gone on to kill my id, to rid myself of anxiety, to figure out why I was existing, what my purpose was. And in that case, I felt extremely seen by this, and God, what a show. What a show.